But we want to talk a little bit more about what it is that keeps these problems so entrenched and why it's so difficult to move past them. And so this is our second of three panels, and joining us here to discuss the issue are Wesley Bell, who was recently elected prosecuting attorney in St. Louis County, which includes Ferguson, Missouri, in addition to 88 municipalities and over 55 police departments. We have Professor Christy Lopez, who's at Georgetown and was previously with the Department of Justice, and in her role there investigated police departments across the country, including in Ferguson, Missouri. Anquan Boldin, who we've all met. And we have Ray Tassif, who is a lawyer here in Washington. I'm from Washington, D.C., in Miami, Florida. And he was a former defense attorney and is currently a civil rights attorney and has experience with criminal defendants and actually with plaintiffs suing the police departments for police misconduct. And so I guess I'll just throw it to you guys to start talking about it, which is like, what structurally is it that you guys see that makes these issues so entrenched? It makes it so hard to move past these issues, even when we have people who, and this touches on some of the questions we were asked, within the police departments might want to move forward, might want to do better.
Okay, great. So I investigated police departments for patterns or practices of misconduct from Chicago to New Orleans to Ferguson to LA to Newark, and we learned a little something about the structural obstacles to changing police along the way. A lot of them were mentioned by the previous panel. It's absolutely the history of policing and our tortured history with race. It has a lot to do with socioeconomic inequality. And specifically how that relates to policing, I think we've seen that there are legal barriers to change. A lot of normal human behavior is criminalized in our country. There are insufficient constraints on policing. We give police enormous power. There's a broad scope of policing that we allow. A lot of things that are actually they're social problems. We deploy police to respond to them. Police will tell you this. Communities know this, but we send out police when we need social workers, when we need medical care, when we need mental health care, when we need education. We have a criminal justice system that is uniquely punitive in the the whole entire world. We hand out long sentences, much longer than in other countries. We have harsh conditions of incarceration. And I know this isn't a mass incarceration symposium, but that influences policing. It influences who comes back out into communities and how well they are, and it tears apart communities, and that influences policing. And then I think the last thing I'll just mention is guns. I mean, guns are a huge barrier to police reform in this country in a couple of ways. One is they contribute to the type of violence that we see in the streets, and they really contribute to some of the more, as we were talking about earlier, police are taught that every person they meet can kill them. And a lot of the obstacle to training police in de-escalation is that, unlike in some other countries, like in the UK, where they've been more successful with de-escalation, there is a valid argument people can make here that people in the United States are more likely to carry a weapon. And we've seen that everywhere, that when you have a proliferation of guns, it makes it more difficult to argue that police should be more restrained.
So I'm going to use an anecdote. If you study wars and strategy and things of that nature, if you take if you set up defensive bulwarks, and we've seen so many examples throughout the years of smaller armies being able to hold off and sometimes defeat much larger armies because they were prepared. They were able to set up these defenses and things of that nature. And that's similar to what we're dealing with respect to law enforcement, is that we've had, and to Jeff's point on the last panel, generations of systems that have been in place that are designed to operate in a certain way. And they're designed to, the recruiting is designed to recruit certain types of individuals to law enforcement. And when we try to counteract that, and when we start trying to push changes and push reforms, we see these defenses are so built up, and not just from a standpoint of of operations, but also from media, messaging, and things of that nature. There is such a defensive, again, bulwark that is set up and in place that, and so many people who have made their careers and feed their families off the way the system works, off the status quo. And so some of those, the biggest hurdles are getting beyond that. And I think it starts with educating and outreach, because, you know, we are on the right side of history. There's no question about that. And I've gone into some of the most conservative areas in my region and in some hostile crowds. And when you start explaining to them the why of what we're doing, the why cash bail is not effective, the why we need to put much more of an emphasis on community policing, why we do need diversity, because at the conversation before, diversity is not the only answer, but it is a component of that change. And so I think that we have to focus on, we have to realize the battle and how the battle lines have been drawn for generations. And we're fighting an uphill battle, and it's going to take some casualties. And I don't mean that literally, hopefully, because we don't want anyone to die literally, but it's going to take some hits on our side because this system has been in place so long.
First of all, thank you very much for having me be part of this, I think, very important discussion. I was sitting with Philip Agnew, who's on the next panel, and we were teasing each other. A lot of ground was covered in the first one. Yeah. And so, I'm going to touch on some of those issues as well and perhaps expand on them. First thing I want to say is I can't emphasize enough, in my view, as a practicing attorney, sort of in the trenches, the history and the culture issue and how imperative it is that be addressed. And to be real about it. It took hundreds of years for these things to be the way they are. It's, we're not going to have a savior come to earth and actually, snap his finger or wave a magic wand and these things be changed. Police forces in this country, as was mentioned, and I'll say it even more explicitly, in large parts of this country, both in the North and South, were established to chase down runaway slaves. So the racial component of policing in the United States is as American as apple pie, and we cannot forget that. You combine that with, over the most recent 30 to 50 years, the militarization of the police. And we see that particularly in light of 9/11. But that was happening even before. And when I mean militarization, I mean our police forces are armed with equipment and utility vehicles that they use in actual wars. And so when you start from the standpoint of a war perspective, it suddenly becomes what? Us versus them. My life versus their lives, okay? And you add the racial component to that, and who do you think wins out when you have black, brown, poor, immigrant people? They're going to be on the short end of the stick. So I think that the obstacle of change or the problems with holding police officers accountability is deeply rooted in our history and our culture. I want to speak specifically, perhaps, and there's a long list. I mean, this panel could be three days, not just 1 hour or 40 minutes or whatever. Also, I want to talk about police unions. I want to start off with that. I want to add to what's already been said. And let me just say this before. I'm a big believer in unions in this country. Okay? My father had a master's degree in education. In the summer, he also worked construction jobs. He was a member of 2 different unions, okay? Construction union and the teachers union. My mother was a teacher in the teachers union. She led a strike so the kids had better conditions for education. I'm a big believer in unions. However, I am absolutely opposed to racist police unions. And that's what we have in too many cities in this country. I'll give you an example, okay? Here in Miami, which I'm very familiar with, the head of the Miami Police Union, okay, and I'm gonna read this because these folks don't exactly, I'm not on their top 10 list of favorite people, and I want to make sure I get it right so I'm not accused of saying something that's not true. But the former president of the FOP in this city had 34 citizen complaints. He was suspended after a woman filed a temporary restraining order against him. He had 18 use of force incidents, okay? he made racially insensitive, to say the least, racist statements about Beyonce after her performance, okay, at the Super Bowl several years ago. He called Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old child who was gunned down for no reason in Cleveland, Ohio. He called him publicly a thug, okay? Guess what happened to this particular officer? He was promoted from lieutenant to captain, okay? Police unions in this state are in large part buttressed by a scheme of laws we have in Florida which involve the Police Officer Bill of Rights, which Florida is one of about a third of the states in the country that has this. It's procedural protections for police officers when they're accused of misconduct on the job. Florida was the second state in the country that enacted such a law. And I'm all for due process. I defended criminal cases as a public defender, as a private practitioner. I think all people should be treated fairly, but this is super duper process that if you want to allow police officers, every criminal defendant in the United States should have the advantage that the police have and under the Police Bill of Rights in Florida. Let me give you an example. The Police Bill of Rights in Florida allows for the police officer to give a statement after an incident at a time and place of his or her choice, okay? They are allowed to, prior to giving that statement, to review the entire file. That means look at all the other statements of all the other witnesses, look at the physical evidence, look at the video evidence in preparation for their own statement. Now, you don't need to be a lawyer. You just have to have some common sense, okay? If I'm about to be asked about a very important incident that either threatens my own livelihood or those of others, and I get to see what everybody said about this before I give my statement, do you think I might be influenced to tailor my statement a certain way to either protect myself or the others in a way that's not truthful? I mean, that's an outrage to me, okay? I mean, and so I'm just saying, these are one of many, many examples. I know District Attorney Mr. Bell, I know, recently keeping aware of these things in St. Louis. I mean, these issues are happening everywhere. And I'll just say finally, they exist and they happen because our elected leaders negotiate labor contracts with these police forces that are, again, I'm a big believer in due process and unions, but these are over the top. They make it virtually impossible. There's arbitration provisions in many of the municipalities here in Florida that make it virtually impossible, okay, to fire a police officer. I'll give you an example. Between 2014 and 2018, there were 12 police officers who were fired by the city of Miami. 6 of them got their job back. One of them was a case that I was involved in where the man shot an unarmed black man in the back in a car at a basic routine traffic stop. Okay, so ultimately all what we're talking about is a political question, and I don't want to step on Philip's toes or the next panel, but this is ultimately a political question where we need more protests, we need more outrage, we need more lawsuits, we need more advocacy on these issues to affect real change.
And so there's quite obviously a lot of overlap between all these issues, and as you all have pointed out, and that's why we'll get to everybody's questions, and it's impossible to sort of talk about one without talking about the other, so don't worry too much about that. But I hear you talking about so much of the legal protections that that police have, and sort of in being able to shield them from the consequences of their actions in ways that I, for example, as a longtime defense attorney, never had my clients allowed to review statements made about them before one of their cases. So, Anquan, you talked on the first panel a little bit about your experience dealing with the case that you described, and I know that you went and you talked to some legislatures as well as sort of going to the courtroom. How did you sort of feel like you were? Did you feel like you were able to make any movement? Did you get pushback from people? I mean, and you especially as somebody with the platform you have as a celebrity, the celebrity that you are, is somebody who you would think folks would listen to much more than people who are dealing with this in the community every day. Did you nonetheless feel like you sort of ran into some walls as you were dealing with it?
Most definitely. And I mean, I completely agree about, he's talking about the protections that police have. I can remember just like with my cousin's case, the officer was, who killed my cousin, he did a reenactment. And I can see on the video, the detective pretty much telling him, don't. Not right now. You don't have to. But he was so arrogant in that moment. I'm fine. I got it. And I'm like, you have to be kidding me. And the guy tells him, like on 5 different occasions, like pretty much don't do this right now. And he went ahead and did it. But the only saving grace was my cousin was on the phone with roadside assistance. And the girl on the other end continued the call. So when his statement and reenactment was put to match with the phone call, it didn't match up. And that was the only saving grace that my family had, was that this girl on the other end continued the call. A lot of times when we go talk to, people in positions of power, a lot of times they're reluctant to try and bring about change because of consequences that they may face. And it's disheartening for us because, and I think a lot of us would agree, our heart is basically for people. When something is wrong, it's wrong. When something is right, it's right. Let's deal with it and let's get past it. But we put people in positions of power who have, and a lot of them may go in with the right intentions. They may go in with, I'm going to do the right thing. But there's too often other things come into play. There's other motivating factors, whether it be money or whatever it is, other positions of power. And this is something that we talk about like as a coalition because we truly want to see change. But there's just some things you talk about, especially if you talk about police accountability, where there's just this wall put up. And then it's always us versus them. And for us, it's not us versus them. It's us working and living together and doing what's right for people. And then the first response we get is, well, what about cops that get killed? Do cops get killed? Yes. Do we want that to happen? Of course not. I have family member who's in law enforcement. But you can't bring that up every time we try to hold you accountable for the unarmed shooting of black and brown people or people in low-income areas. That's not an excuse. But these are the people that are supposed to protect and serve us. These are the people who are supposed to uphold justice. So what do we do in this country when those who are in a position to uphold justice don't? Or they break the rules? How do we hold them accountable?
And I think that's why, folks look to prosecutors a lot. And I think you number one, you guys are kind of in this position where you rely on their work, right? At least that's the perception, right? And you're also sort of being asked to kind of play this dual role where you're also asked to hold them accountable in the way that any one of us in the community would expect to be held accountable for any kind of misconduct. I think it might help if you sort of talked about your role a little bit sort of in the middle of that and also maybe talk about what you walked into, right? So you were elected last year, took office, January 1st this year? Yep. And even before you took office, there was, the wall and the defenses that you talked about started to come up. So I think your experience is probably pretty illustrative for us of what people face trying to navigate that.
And I want to quickly comment on something that Anquan and Mr. Tassel talked about. In the union, this was prior to me coming into office, negotiated with St. Louis County a rule that in a police shooting, officers, before being questioned, get 2 sleep cycles before they can be questioned. And I remember the first time, I've been in here 3 months, and so we had an officer-related shooting, and it by all accounts, it was a clean shooting. And so I didn't know this rule. I'm sitting with the officers, and my first question is, well, let's get the officer in and talk to him. And then they explained this rule to me, and I'm like, wait, what? And if we know this is a clean shooting, and I said this, if we know this is a clean shooting, in addition to all the other issues with that type of rule, why doesn't he just waive it and just come on in and let's just get this done? But to your question, prior to coming into the office, my predecessor, who had been in office for close to 30 years, now certain attorneys, not all, I want to be clear on that, some attorneys in the office decided, well, now we think that we should unionize. Now, like you, Mr. Tassif, I am a staunch supporter of unions. I was in the teachers union myself when I taught at one of the local colleges. However, they chose to align themselves with the St. Louis City Police Officers Union, which inherent is just a conflict of interest and just the appearance. As prosecutors, we serve as checks on law enforcement, and that appearance of working with them when prosecutors all over the country are fighting that perception that we are too closely aligned and interdependent with law enforcement, I think just goes to show those walls, those barriers that are in place when 33 attorneys in our office didn't see it. And when we talk to them and say, perhaps you maybe consider a different union and there wouldn't be any problem, it just goes right over their head. And so, yeah, there are a lot of, now let me just say that they did vote to do that. However, I've made it clear that short of a Missouri Supreme Court justice ordering me to negotiate with them, I'm not. So the collective bargaining process has not started and will not start short of those things happening. But it just shows that those barriers exist. And the anecdote I used before about the military bulwarks, think of the movie 300. Many of you saw that movie? And there were 300 people there against, I think, a couple 100,000, and because of those defensive positions, they were able to hold them off for an extended period of time. Now, reverse that. Imagine the couple 100,000 people behind the defensive bulwarks and 300 people trying to capture them. And I think that's the situation that we're in when we talk about criminal justice reform. And so there are institutional roadblocks that are in place, that have been in place for decades, and I'm seeing that 3 months on the job, and on with the coming off Ferguson, and I was a city councilman in Ferguson. Matter of fact, I got to work with this wonderful person to my left, and just had some of the conversations that we had is that we see how siloed so many of our communities are, and there are about 18,000 police departments, and in my community there are 88 municipalities and 55 police departments, and all of them have their own little culture. And one thing that was eye-opening for me working with Christy and the rest of her team on the Department of Justice, President Obama's Department of Justice, I want to clarify, was the idea that they brought so many different thoughts and policies that we had not used in this culture. And when you're in a culture, no matter if you have the best intentions or not, you can get caught up in not understanding that there are different ways to approach things. And I'm going to use one quick example before I turn it back over. And Christy will probably remember this, is that in St. Louis County, occupancy permits were weaponized to use for police officers to run checks and arrest people. And that's something that had been going on for generations in St. Louis County. And so when we're sitting in that room and they're telling us, they're talking to us about how occupancy permits are not for that. You should not have to report to Big Brother exactly the names of the people that are in your community. Well, other members on our team were like, well, we think that they serve a great purpose. And I just had to scratch my head and say, you know, we're going to take a time out. I need to talk to my team. And so I talked to them like, guys, do you hear yourselves? But they have been so vested in this culture and this way of thinking that even when presented with what is clearly a reasonable policy and a smart policy and an effective policy, they were still resistant to it. And I think that's just a microcosm of the challenges and hurdles that we have to overcome when approaching criminal justice reform.
So, Professor Lopez, maybe you can talk a little bit about your experience in Ferguson and doing this kind of across the country. I mean, I can't imagine that these folks like to have people there investigating. Sort of like, do you find that they kind of put up these walls? Is it a situation, or what? How do they try to put up walls for you as you're trying to investigate? Is this the kind of thing that you see? Does it manifest itself in the same way in across the country, or is sort of every jurisdiction fighting back against that kind of thing differently? And so then what also is the role, you think, of federal oversight and or prosecutors in all of this? What kind of role could that play in trying to really investigate and try to eliminate some of these barriers?
Okay, so I do remember that, and I want to sort of I want to add something to that anecdote because I think it really helps explain how problematic that thinking was. In that particular case, what we had found was that part of the way that, in Ferguson, it was very much about using the police to control people's lives, especially the lives of black people. It was a community that had gone from majority white to majority black, and people did not want to lose control of black bodies. That's really what a lot of what it was about. And what we saw with these occupancy permits is that you literally had to tell them the names and ages of every individual who was renting an apartment. And if that changed, it was problematic, to the extent that when a woman called the police to report that she was the victim of domestic violence, the police department went out to her apartment, and her boyfriend had left, but they saw indicia that he lived there. His clothes were there and things like that. And so they arrested her for violating her occupancy permit. And she said, and the officer wrote in the officer's report, she says that she will never call the police again, even if she is being killed. And we included that in the report because it was reflective of the sentiments we were hearing from everybody in Ferguson about how they felt about their police department. And as Aramis said earlier, if you don't care about a dead body in the middle of the road, what do you care about? That's what happened in Ferguson. And it was building on all of these problems. So when we went into that room, we were trying to explain to them, this is what we're trying to break down. I was so grateful that Wes was there to say, we were getting nowhere. They were not people who were interested in thinking differently. And so I remember Wes calling a timeout on that and coming back and having a more constructive conversation. And so that's, I think, one of the first things you have to do, and is something that the work that DOJ did in communities across the country, which is disrupting the narrative, doing what Jeff Robinson said, showing America what policing really is. We go in and we would try to demonstrate that this is not an instance of isolated incidents, bad apples, and that and everyone they're hurting is a terrible person anyway. We try to use the investigative process and the reports that we would write to disrupt that narrative, to tell a true story, to shed new light on that. And I do think that that is a very important part. It is part of the reckoning that, again, Jeff Robinson mentioned, that we have to go through to make a difference. But I do also want to make clear that's only part of the solution. There is a big political component to this. Prosecutors are a big part of that. When I think about the crisis of policing in America, I think about the fact that there's both a chronic crisis, which is that long-standing, historically based crisis, and then there are these acute crises that come up, and they are things like police-involved shootings. They are things of that nature, And we have to be willing to work on solutions that address both the acute crises, because people need relief immediately, but never losing sight that there is a deeper, broader, chronic crisis that we also have to be working towards that is not going to be resolved overnight, as Aramis said earlier. And so I think that for those sorts of things, we need to really be looking towards changes in the law, not only constraints on police, but also changes to unions, police unions. And that's not just overturning problematic Supreme Court precedent, it's state and local laws. So there's a lot that can be done and is being done on those levels. There's some work that needs to be done with what a lot of groups are calling divest, invest. Campaign Zero and the Movement for Black Lives have done a great job talking about how we need to actually take money that we've put into policing and shift that to other social services that are better to respond to the problems that we are facing. We need to reorient the entire criminal justice system to a restorative justice approach. And George Gascon has done work. Prosecutors can play a role in this, by the way, as we all can. And that doesn't mean there's no accountability. That's an important misconception that people have about restorative justice. Accountability is an important part of that. But it's an approach to criminal justice that works to nurture and heal communities rather than punish and penalize them for poverty and not having jobs. And then I think the last thing but I think is really important is we talk about culture change a lot in policing, and I think we should break that down into two components. The first is we need to change how police think. That's easy, right? But that is something we actually have to commit ourselves to doing. The second is we need to change the incentives, and someone on the earlier panel said this as well. We need to get better at rewarding police officers for good behavior. We need to stop rewarding them for arrests and citations and find ways to reward them for the right kind of behavior. And changing police thinking, a lot of people have said that. I want to mention one thing. A lot of people talked about the moral courage it takes to be a police officer and the need for police officers to stand up. And in every department I've investigated across the country, what bothers communities more than the police officer who committed the bad act are all the other police officers who stood there and watched and didn't speak up to do something about that. And we all have to be honest about how often some of us don't speak up, and we have to challenge ourselves, and we have to understand how hard that is for officers, and we have to create systems that allow them to do that. There's a program in New Orleans called Ethical Policing is Courageous, and they actually run every officer through it, and they teach every officer, how do you act, what words do you use, what do you say when you see an officer about to do something wrong, how do you intervene and prevent that from happening or mitigate what's happening. And then the officers wear a pin that's actually signifying that they're giving their fellow officers permission to intervene if they're about to do something wrong. And it's that kind of very intentional, very broad program that I think we need to focus on if we're going to really change how police officers think.
Yeah, I just want to weigh in a little bit on the DOJ involvement. This needs a little explaining, and Professor Lopez, jump in at any time to correct me or to add to what I'm trying to say here. This federal law is 42 U.S.C. 14141 is a law which allows the United States Justice Department to, in essence, take over a local police department, or at least charge them civilly with a pattern and practice of violating constitutional rights. And it's been a law in the book for a long, long time. It was used sparingly, and President Obama breathed new life into it, and suddenly the civil rights community was welcomed with DOJ investigations literally all across the country in a manner and pace and a rate that had never occurred previously to that. And a lot of those investigations led to incredibly wonderful results where, in fact, real reform was had. That takes place, again, in a political context. Those have basically dried up since the election of you-know-who to the White House, okay, under his Justice Department. I mean, that's no accident, because they have an entirely different perspective on what law enforcement is and should be, and they're very defensive about law enforcement, refusing to engage and use this law as a way for police reform. It's an important tool, but it's just one. The city of Miami, for instance, was under DOJ investigation in 2002 and 2006, and then in 2011. And the case that sort of brought them back to Miami was a case involving a joint operation between local officers and United States law enforcement officers, ICE officers, who were doing, in my view, a racist operation called Southern Tempest, where they targeted bars and places in Miami-Dade County, almost exclusively in Liberty City, in the black neighborhoods of Miami, where they were looking for guns and drugs. And they performed an operation, and they saw my client come out of a place. Maybe he'd had a little argument at the door of the bar, but they followed him, and they ended up killing him, shooting him in the back in his car in an incredibly haphazard manner, in which three police vehicles surrounded him, and the officer ended up shooting him in the back of the neck, in the back, Now, the problem there was that the U.S. Justice Department was responsible in large part, and the Justice Department came and investigated, and there was, in fact, a resolution reached, not perhaps as satisfactory as we would have liked. There was no consent decree that was ever reached. It was a settlement agreement which could be redone, and the whole process started over. I won't go into the legal technicalities, but this is the point I'm getting to, is that in that case, as a lawyer on behalf of the family and behalf of other victims of police conduct, misconduct, we had a spate in 2012, 2011, 2012, where one young black man was killed every month for 7 straight months. And that's what led to the DOJ getting involved again. And this is what Ms. Lopez, I think, alluded to, and has been said already by County Attorney Bell, is that the cities themselves hunker down in many instances and make it very difficult for those investigations to take place. In the case in Miami, our team and the family were very frustrated that we didn't get as much as we wanted. And lawyers can talk about outcomes of cases all the time. I'm one of these people, I'm never satisfied until I get it all, And I didn't feel like we got complete justice. But I recognize one of the difficulties the DOJ was involved in that case is that the city of Miami made it very difficult, to say the least, to effectively evaluate in terms of their resistance to accumulating records, in terms of cooperating with the Justice Department investigation. And they fought us tooth and nail on behalf of the family. This is a case where the city of Miami, they themselves, in a rare instance, actually fired the police officer for violating the deceased Fourth Amendment rights. And then when we sued them, they pretended that didn't happen and fought us tooth and nail until finally the Justice Department got involved. And with the pattern and practice evidence that they had accumulated, we were able to reach a very favorable settlement. My point is that these things are complicated, and they're political issues. And elections have consequences. We don't have DOJ investigations popping up. I still don't know why anybody has not looked at the Florida State prison system. That they are now looking in terms of what's happening in the women's prison system. But my point is that this is just one part of an effective strategy that happens locally, countywide, statewide, and nationally. And this is a tool in the toolbox for reform. But there are serious, with all the might of the federal government, it's still an uphill climb, So.
I just wanted to make 3 quick points. The war on drugs created a warrior cop. And why I'm such a big advocate of community policing is it because it changes the idea for officers to not consider themselves warriors, but guardians. And when I look at the criminal justice system, when I look at it from a prosecutor's standpoint, it's that same type of mentality that needs to be changed. When I was, I did a town hall recently, and this was in a very conservative area. And so at the end, this guy comes up, he's pushing at least 90. And he says, you know what, I disagree with everything you believe in. And I said, even the being, focusing resources on serious offenders, that too. But it just occurred to me that, when I was sworn in on January 1st, I didn't take an oath to lock people up. That's not our job as prosecutors. Our job is to serve justice, and whatever that looks like, in whatever direction that takes us. And so the policies that we implemented, we changed our cash bail system internally in our office on day one. We changed our policies so that nonviolent, low-level offenders, CDNEs in Missouri, were no longer, the presumption was not to incarcerate, the presumption was a summons. We changed these things because that's what justice demanded. We were locking too many people up who have no business being in jail. We know the ancillary effects increase the likelihood that they will be back if you incarcerate them even for a short period of time. And so we're changing that dynamic, we're changing that model, and we're expanding diversion and treatment courts because we know that those low-level offenders turn into violent offenders if you don't treat the underlying root of the cause, the drug addiction, the mental health addiction. And so that is now built up defenses in a lot of those criminal justice stakeholders that we talked about, but we're going to keep doing those things because we know that they're right. We talk to other stakeholders in our communities who know that they're right. We work with organizations who know that that's right. And so the time is now, because the pendulum will swing back if we don't push while we have the attention of the country, the attention of the world on criminal justice reform.
Well, I just want to, if I just make 2 points related to that. One is that I think the guardian versus warrior metaphor is a really important and helpful one here. We do really want, and part of changing how police think is trying to get them to think what Sue Rohr, who's a former sheriff in Washington State, called guardian thinking rather than warrior thinking. And that actually relates in part to the diversity component we were talking about earlier. I agree that diversity is not sufficient, but I do believe that it's necessary. It's necessary if insufficient. And that includes not just racial diversity and ethnic diversity, but also gender diversity. And I was always surprised at every community meeting I would go to, I would hear someone say, we need a police department that looks like our community. But they never meant, to my knowledge, it needs to be 50% female, because that's not what people were thinking when they think policing. It is assumed that policing is male. And that's part of the obstacle to having police adopt a guardian mentality, is it goes against what their stereotype of being a masculine police officer is, and we need to really reframe that, which is hard, but something I think we have to take on. And that also reminds me, that sort of necessary but not sufficient idea is how I think about the consent decrees, because I think that's completely right that they're not going to, and the first thing I would say in every community I went to is, if anyone has told you that a consent decree is going to solve policing here, they are lying to you. If it is a necessary but not, it may be necessary, it's certainly not going to be sufficient. But I think what it can do is create the momentum and the space for other actors in that community to step in and do more than they might have been able to do without that. So I do think it's been a big loss. I do think that elections matter. I'm really grateful for all the elections of progressive prosecutors. I'm grateful for people like George Gascon, who was a progressive prosecutor before that was a thing. Those people in those political spots are absolutely poised to create space where right now DOJ is not there.
And I think we give some time for some questions here. We promised Adelius.
Okay. I have one question before I get to this one. We talk about accountability. If I'm with someone and I watch them commit a crime, then I become an accessory. What law is it on the books that stop police officers from being accessory when other police officers commit crime? Maybe that would then put pressure on the guys to, if they're considered accessory, along with the person that has been accused of the crime, maybe that then puts the pressure on them to actually tell the truth. Is there something on the law or their rights or whatever it is that says that police officers can't be charged with accessory or crime when they watch a crime being done?
Well, if I may, from a civil standpoint, if a police officer is needlessly beating a man, okay, and using excessive force, and there are other officers who are standing nearby, those other officers who fail to intervene and stop that excessive force as a matter of liability under the federal civil rights statutes are equally liable. We see this all the time. I mean, and not me, but many You know, lawyers sue police officers all the time for that very event you're talking about. Where, I mean, you remember Rodney King from a long time ago? There was like 20 cops who were standing around watching in that video, okay? Their failure to step in and stop the harm that is happening is a violation of the civil rights statutes for which they can become civilly liable. I'll defer perhaps to the rest of the panel on the issue of criminal liability. That's a much more difficult question.
I just wanted to add, though, those cases can be hard to win because a lot of times juries will have sympathy for officers, and because the defense counsel for officers will do a really good job saying, well, how would you have been able to step in? Would you have been able, for all the reasons we've been talking about, you'll be ostracized, you lose your job, you won't be effective. And so that's why programs like the one I was talking about, EPIC, are so important, because you actually we have to demand that our police departments train officers on how to intervene and then hold them accountable when they do not just as a matter of law, but as department policy.
And I think the underlying point is, and to use a quick anecdote, is that we look in many communities of color, many poor communities, and there is a taboo about cooperating with police. And we're so critical of that because, if you want to correct some of these issues, the violent crime in your community, well, you need to cooperate so that offenders can be held accountable. But then on the other side of that, we don't see that same, we see that same culture in law enforcement. And we need to change that culture and address those cultural issues in our law enforcement organizations so that officers will start to point out the bad seeds. And that's one of the issues that we have to deal with, because they will be ostracized. They will, in all likelihood, be disciplined. But until the good ones, which is the overwhelming majority of them, start pointing out the bad ones, we're not going to see any real change. And I couldn't agree more.
Hi, my name's Damaris. I'm an assistant public defender here, and as I look around the room, I see several of my colleagues here. What I don't see are assistant state attorneys or judges in this room. And I find that really disconcerting, because we've all chosen our life's career to do this because we know these realities. So my question for you is, one thing we haven't talked about is the role that judges can play in holding police officers accountable. When I go in, I had one of my attorneys say, guess what, I lost my motion to suppress because it was my client's word versus the officer, and we know how that goes every time. So I guess my question to you is, what can we do to spread this message amongst the people in the system that really need to hear it? The people who, I've come across many state attorneys in the last 10 years who just refuse to believe their officers might be lying, or refuse to believe my client might be telling the truth. How do we change that, and how do we encourage and educate judges to know that what's going out on the streets can stop here, right? Evidence can get suppressed here. False confessions can get suppressed here, and they're supposed to be the gatekeepers that do that.
Well, first of all, I started my career as a public defender, so I'm right here with you. Thanks for the work you do. I've served as a judge, so I guess I can help that representation on the panel as well. One thing that we did was our leadership team stays in constant contact with our judiciary in St. Louis County. And that's something that wasn't happening before. And so, for example, when we one of the day one policies that we enacted, and Jess, who was around here, was integral in that as well, is we changed our policies on child support. We were seeing too many people that were being prosecuted criminally just because they couldn't afford to pay child support, and so we switched to a civil contempt process. To avoid the jail time, to avoid the stigma of the felony convictions. But in doing that, logistically, we had to have buy-in from the judiciary, because we needed more dockets so that we could keep up with the with this new change in policy. And so we did reach out to the judiciary, and they added 3 more dockets to help us with that. But to your point, you're right. We do need more education of our judges. Sometimes all of us who have been before judges, you are on your best behavior. And judges can sometimes have that mindset of, well, hey, everybody's answering to me and they're on their best behavior. I must be doing a great job. But you're right. We have to make sure that they are educated as well, and that it's hard to force them from our standpoint to get educated unless you have a judge who's willing to. But I think that's an important component of any criminal justice reform, is that you have to have judges who also understand the max sentence isn't always appropriate. Alternatives to incarceration are just as important. Treatment courts and things of that nature are just as important. And again, thank you for your service.
I think that's an excellent point, and it's something that I have been trying to work on. I actually led a training for state judges have meetings every year, right? And they all get together in one place, which is really convenient if you want to get to all of them at once. And so I went to these trainings with 2 law enforcement officers to talk specifically not just about the ways that judges impact the criminal justice system, but specifically the issue of police misconduct. And I think the messenger is really important in that context, and so I think prosecutors actually can play a really big role here. I went in with police chiefs to say, look, I am telling you, the police chiefs were saying to the judges, that officers are test-lying. They're getting on the stand and they are lying. They are committing excessive force, you're not catching it. They're planting evidence, you're not catching it. I need you to help me as a good chief, tamp down on that. And I will do my part and you can do your part. And that message, if prosecutors can, and I'm not saying that is easy, but if prosecutors can get together with judges and progressive police chiefs and say, look, let's make something happen differently in this community. And if you don't have that in your community, then I think you bring outsiders in to talk about how judges need to lead on this. But I do think it's really helpful if you can have law enforcement voices in the room to affirm for judges that yes, this happens, and then judges are in a unique position to tamp down on it, and they have not done so.
If I may, I agree with everything that's just been said, but I'll be even more direct. Too often, and in many, many cases, the judges are co-conspirators in the violation of people's rights on a daily basis, minute by minute. You go to any criminal court in this country, I practice in New York City, Chicago, and here in Miami, go to a daily calendar call and watch what really happens. Watch a motion to suppress and watch what really happens. And frankly, the judges who are there to combat lawlessness engage in the very lawlessness that they are sworn to uphold, in that they routinely violate people's rights. They violate decisional law, Supreme Court cases all the time. Unfortunately, because of the meat grinder system that the criminal justice system, often those cases are never positioned to actually challenge, because what happens is that most people in the criminal justice system end up taking pleas. And the system becomes a mill where people's rights are forfeited all the time. Again, I mean, one answer is, training of judges and sensitizing them is certainly one. There used to be a judge in Chicago who would keep a card box on his bench and would make notes of specific police officers who he believed were lying. And so then when he had to make credibility findings a week later, a year later, he would refer and say, I had this particular officer, and this officer has shown himself to be lying or deceptive on prior occasions. It's a mindset change. And again, we're not just talking about police officers, we're talking about system-wide involving the judges. I think, to sit here today, I mean, having done this long enough, to sit here and hear Mr. Bell say that it's not the prosecutor's job to put people in cages, I never would have thought years ago when I went to law school, and from the type of work that I've done and the people that I've represented, I would never hear such a thing. We had a person run for Attorney General, an African-American man here in Florida, and his platform was about environmental justice and reform of criminal justice. I would have never thought that would happen. And, at the same time, I think it's wonderful. We need to hold people like Mr. Bell, and I'm sure he welcomes that. He welcomes the type of scrutiny. But these folks need our support. We cannot sit on the sidelines, because this is a political process. When the police union is doing the nonsense that he was talking about earlier, we need to rally behind people who've demonstrated the courage to step forward, okay, and make decisions like he's making. Make justice and fairness the priority, and not put people in cages. And I use that term purposely, because we try to sanitize what happens here. The criminal justice system, in large part, is a way to control black and brown and minority poor immigrant people. I spent 3 days this week touring prisons to see whether or not a consent decree for the Florida State prison system. If people saw the conditions that they are put in cages, okay? This is what's happening. We have human capital. We have lives that are being inalterably changed. We're giving up on particularly young black men at a rate that is staggering. We're losing a generation of people, okay? This is serious business, and we're not fighting hard enough to take those issues on. We need to support the judges. And in our state, the election process controls who's judges. We need to promote the candidacy of progressive thinking people who, and I'm not asking for a rubber. As a lawyer, I would love the judge to say, granted, you're right, Mr. Tassif, every time I appeared in court. That ain't going to happen. But what I want is somebody who's not predisposed to think that the government is right, the prosecutor's correct, the police are being truthful, and I want somebody who's going to look at that objectively. I want a fair shake. And that doesn't happen. I'll say one last thing, is that, again, in this city, in this county, in any place in the United States, okay, go to an arraignment call where they start court session, they open the side door, and they bring in a chain gang of young black people. It's an astonishing event. In fact, you'll hear some court personnel tease that there's actually a white person in the group. Okay? See that take place. See how his system almost takes a jocular approach to it sometimes.